бачити. Дуже раді вас бачити, але щоб нам цю атмосферу, тобто здобути атмосферу лекторію і щоб поринути у світ отого всього, що нам будуть сьогодні, про що нам будуть сьогодні розповідати, я пропоную на правах господаря і модератора розпочати все з музики. Бо мистецтво, як ви знаєте, вічне.
Добрий вечір, друзі. І хочеться заграти вам Григорія Сковороду. Всякому городу грають права. Всякому городу ради права, всяка имеет свою голова, всякому сердцу своя есть любовь, всякому горлу свой вкус есть коров. А мені одна тільки в світі дума, а мені одна не виходить з ума. Петька хитрець у глибанський трет, Петька купець під аршином все лже. Тот строїть дом свій на новий манір, тот весь процентах пожалуй повір. А мені одна тільки в світі дума, а мені одна не виходить з ума. Ті непрестанно стяжають грунта, ті на страні заводять скота, ті формирують на ловлю собак, тих тріщить дома до стейках кабак. А мені одна тільки в світі дума, а мені одна не виходить з ума. Строїть на свой дом юриста права, з диспут студента тріщить голова. Тих безпокоїть Венерин Амур, аж твою голову мучить світу. А мені одна тільки в світі дума, а мені одна не виходить з ума. Смерть страшна, замашна, як осо, ти не щадиш ані царських красот. Ти не глядиш, де мужик, а де цар, все жереш так, як солому пожар. Хто ж на твою дев'ятострую став? Хто, у кого совість, як чистий кришталь?
Дякуємо. Це музика видатної людини, яку світ ловив, але так і не спіймав. Всі ви знаєте. І в нас є сьогодні дуже гарні гості, але серед цих гостей ми не можемо точно обминути. Це посла Норвегії в Україні і просимо до слова пана Ле.
Дякую. Я очень радий бути у вас сьогодні ввечері. І бачите, що така аудиторія повна студентами чи іншими зацікавленими людьми, які хочуть слухати про нашу спільну історію вікінгських часів, якщо можна так сказати. Це початок, я думаю, нового проєкту співпраці між Норвегією та Україною, де будемо вивчати більш про історію Київської Русі. І маємо двох видатних норвезьких експертів, які будуть вас розповідати про це. І запитати, звичайно, посольства Норвегії. Я сам дуже цікавлюсь історією, особливо історією, яка нас об'єднує, історичні форми, які нас об'єднує, український та норвезький. So I'm I'm very happy to see so many people here tonight, and especially guests from University of Oslo. You will present yourselves, Professor who will both have lectures for you on the different aspects of the history of the Vikings in this part of the world. So I'm happy that so many people came. Didn't expect so many people. But it's a positive surprise, and I think this is a good start for this project of cooperation between Norway and Ukraine, where we will study more in detail and learn much more about this history which unites us. So thank you all for coming, and I wish you a nice evening. Сподіваюсь, що ми всі много будемо навчатися під час рішення. Дякую.
Дякуємо вам. Запрошуємо нашого першого спікера.
It's great to see you all here. I had never imagined that I would stand in such a full auditorium tonight. I'm very happy about that. I'm very happy to be here. I hope that you will find it interesting what and I have to tell you. We just listened to a beautiful piece of music and song. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about tonight could have been a song. It is not. It is a tapestry, but it is a tapestry with a story in it. And I suppose here, at least in Scandinavia and in the Scandinavian world, great deeds, important stories were translated into poems and songs and preserved through that. And the story that I'm going to talk about today is one of these stories, just preserved not in a song but in a tapestry. There is a special reason for choosing this theme tonight, the Bayeux tapestry, and that is that Gunn and I, we are here because we are working with Viking Age studies. We are interested in understanding how the Viking Age came around, what was the forces that made it happen. So I thought, going here to give a presentation, I should not try to be talking about the things that I want to know, the things that I want to learn from here, namely how the Viking Age unfolded in this part of the world, or said in another way, how what happened in this part of the world influenced the Viking Age. This is something for the future, for me to discover, hopefully together with all of you in a future cooperation. But what I want to do is I want to talk about one of the most important things in the Viking Age, and that was actually the ships. And the way that ships were being used in order to facilitate warfare and trade and exploration. And to do that, I've chosen the most detailed source, which actually tells us about how was ships perceived, what was important for the people building and using these ships. And that is the Bayeux tapestry. Maybe I can make this. Yeah. So, yeah. We do know about the ships of the Viking Age from archaeological finds. We have a few finds which are very large ships which have been produced for and owned by and used by the uppermost level of society, the kings, princes, jarls, and so on. and they are difficult to interpret as any archaeological object is, so therefore it is good to turn to other sources. Although we do learn a lot from the archaeological sources about how ships were being built, we learn how they were very lightly built, we learn how try to reduce the amount of material at any point in the building process in order to produce ships which were as slender and as strong as possible in order to make them into efficient warships. But what we do not know is really how was that perceived. Was that just a measure of practical thinking, or were there other ideals behind? And the Bayeux tapestry can help us to understand that. Now about the Bayeux tapestry, it's a unique piece of art. It's 70-meter long, half-meter high strip of textile which has been embroidered with pictures depicting the history of how William the Conqueror became the conqueror, namely how he conquered England. And it takes place in the years around 1066, up to and around 1066. Duke William was not Scandinavian, his ancestors were, but he was Duke in Normandy, northern France. And the story in the tapestry is told from the viewpoint of the Normans, not from the viewpoint of the Anglo-Saxons who were defeated. It was produced shortly after the Battle of Hastings in 1066, perhaps for the inauguration of the cathedral in Bayeux in 1077. Bayeux, the cathedral in Bayeux, that was where the tapestry was kept and preserved for centuries, but it actually seems like it was being produced not in Normandy but in Canterbury in England. That means in the territories which had just been conquered a few years before. It's a miracle that we have it still today. It survived the French Revolution, where it was almost being used as textile to cover weapons with. A wise person stopped that. It survived the First and the Second World War, and today it is on display in Bayeux. If you haven't been there, go and see it at some point. It will actually be going back, perhaps, to UK in 2022, probably because they're going to refurnish the exhibition rooms, so that's an opportunity as well. It's not the only source that we have to the conquest of England. There are a couple more, and especially one. This folio mentioned down here, called William's Ship List, is important for understanding how the ships were being used. Here is the background for that battle and the conquest. The thing is that Edward the Confessor died on the 5th of January in 1066, and he had no kids. So it was not clear who was going to inherit the English crown. So different people meant that they were they had the right. Two of them were especially important. One was William, because through a long detour he was actually in the bloodline of Edward the Confessor via Emma of Normandy. So he was in that sense a real heir. But there was also a man called Harold Godwinson, and his father was the most powerful person in Anglo-Saxon England. He was actually more powerful than Edward the Confessor himself. And he had managed to get his daughter, Edith, married with Edward the Confessor. So if they had had a child, then of course everything would have been fine. He would have achieved his goal. But since there was no child, then Harold meant that, okay, because my sister was married to Edward the Confessor, that I should be the king. And the English nobility meant that as well, and crowned him. I'll just give you a very brief run of the narrative in the Bayeux Tapestry. And it actually starts before the tapestry starts, 1052, because Edward promises William in Normandy that he shall inherit the English crown if Edward remains without any children. So that's the background. Edward instructs Harold Godwinson to sail to Normandy and confirm that promise, and that's of course a way of blocking Harold from trying to become king himself. And also that Harold shall swear loyalty to William, and that happens in 1064. And this is actually what we see on this scene, where we see Harold going on board in his ship, sailing across the channel and getting to Normandy, where he is actually captured by one of the counts in Normandy. Then a lot of things happens, and Harold Godwinson is brought back to England on William's ships. I have an emphasis on the ships here, so that you just know in what context we see them. And this is what is happening here. Harold swears loyalty to William, and then he is sailed back probably in William's ship. Then Edward the Confessor dies, and Harold Godwinson actually accepts the English crown, which is being offered to him from the nobility in England. He should not have done that. He does it. That's very bad, and as a bad omen. There's actually a Halley's Comet is coming and disrupting everything, and everybody gets terribly scared. But Harold has made his bad choice. And William's get to know that because there's a ship sailing to Normandy to inform William about the treason by Harold. So William prepares an invasion fleet, and that's what we're seeing here. Building a brand new fleet with a lot of ships, and they are being towed down to the coast and are ready for departure. And then, of course, the invasion comes, and it's a mighty display of force. 1,000 ships is set out on the water, transporting William's army to Normandy, and there the battle takes place. And Harold actually dies. And then William is the victor and becomes King of England. What the tapestry emphasizes the role of the horses of William's army, how important these mounted fighters, the knights, are in actually winning that war. So this is the story, very briefly. There is one scene which is apparently lost, and from the tapestry, the last 2 meters or so is missing, but that would of course have shown William being crowned as the rightful King of England on Christmas Day 1066. So this was the story. Now what do we do with it if we want to know something about the ships? well, you would do something very tedious. You sit down and then you start to measure all the ships on that tapestry. There are some 37 ships, I think it is. You take the measurements and you note every little detail that you can see on these ships. You do that systematically for all the ships. Then you have a comparative material so that you can start to make comparisons between the ships of the English, the ships of the Normans, the ships which are being used for one purpose, the ships which are being used for another purpose. And in that way you can actually start to decipher what the person or persons who designed that tapestry was intending to say with the ships. So that's what I've been doing, and it leads me to just a few observations that it was possible to make. One observation is that ships in the tapestry have different proportions. And the one ship that is the most interesting for us, namely the ship of William himself, the one that he is using when he is directing the fleet across the channel. It turns out that actually is a special ship, because as you can see on the upper figure, which shows the relation between the height of the hull amidships and the length of the hull, it shows that this black square up there, that actually William's ship is the most slender ship. It's the one which is lowest compared to its length of all the ships in the tapestry. It's almost also the biggest, but it's definitely the most slender one. And then when you're looking at its total height and the length, then you'll see that it's also extreme in that sense that it is the highest one in relation to its length. It takes up a big space in the tapestry, and that's what you see down there. So clearly we can confirm, yes, William's ship is special compared to the other ones. So what might that mean? Well, it does make a difference for the visual impression of the ships. Here are two examples. You have William's ship over there, the long, slender one, and you have an English ship here. And I don't know if you can see it, but for me it's very easy to see that the English one is rather tubby, so a bit thick, and William's ship is really a long and slender one. So there is something to be said also about the sailing skills that the two main characters, Harold and William, shows when they're sailing. We take a look first at Harold's ship here, and it's the most detailed depiction of a sail in the entire tapestry. But it's also a sail which is somewhat in disorder, with a lot of wrinkles and funny shapes and so on. And then we look at the way that Harold's sail is looking, and it's just, again, very slim, very elegant. It's well done, you could say. There is a special thing about the way that the sails are being shown here, because they are shown in a kind of twisted perspective. So you have the yardarm in the top, a line along the ship, but the sail itself, it's really twisted like this, so that at the bottom you see it directly from the side, so that it has no sides. That's why it's looking so peculiar. So William is a better sailor, but it goes further than that, because he's also a very good commander. Harold is shown with 5 pictures sailing his own ship, one ship across the channel, with this wiggly waggly sail on it. Here we have the entire invasion field. Now I want you to try to look at the sails on the ships in the top row, and you can see that they are in disorder. It's like you are having what should actually be stripes of color, which is going down along the sail, is in complete disorder there. So it's very clear that here we have sails which are not in order. If we're looking at the people in the ships, then they are standing, they are arguing, discussing, they are looking around. There's a lot of chaos going on. When you're looking at the shields, then everybody is standing with his own shield and it's not organized in any way. If you go down and look at the ships in the lower row, then you see that now the sails are just standing very straight. You have these stripes just going perfectly in perfect shapes down to the lower edge of the sail. If you're looking at the people, they are sitting orderly in the ships. If you're looking at the shields, they have been mounted on the sides of the ship, so everything is in order there. The difference between the upper row and the lower row is that the upper row is what you read first when you are reading the tapestry, when you're seeing it. And then in the beginning of the second row, we actually have William's ship. And William takes control. And that's why you suddenly see that everything is now in order. And instead of ships sailing one by one, then suddenly they are sailing in a close formation just next to each other. So you really depict William as the big commander of this big fleet. One of the other sources about William's conquest of England tells us that William sailed out from Normandy with this huge fleet, and there was a lot of chaos going on, and then darkness came upon the ships. It was night, and everybody was a little bit scared, and William just said, oh, we'll just stay here right in the middle of the sound of the channel, and in the morning we'll continue. And then morning came, and he just said, oh, arrange my breakfast for me. And then he was sitting there and having this breakfast, and then all the ships could find him, and then he could direct the fleet and go into Hastings and make the invasion. So even that source we have this story. Then there is one more observation I just briefly want to mention. The fleet's composition, and a starting point there is the observation that on some of the ships, not on all of them, but on some of them, there are shields, big shields, at the stem or the stern. We have it on Harold's ship up there, and we have it on these three first ships in the invasion fleet. Now what does that mean? We know from later sources from Scandinavia that shields mounted in that way was a way to show who was sailing in these ships. So could it be like that here? Well, it might well be Harold, from a Norman opinion, was not a king. He was an earl. That was his position. So we can try and test, could this be that this is what this shield is saying, that here comes the earl, because there's no shield on William's ship we have seen. Now actually, if we now turn to this ship list and the information which is in that one, then you can see that of all those people providing the ships for the invasion fleet, 3 of them are counts, that's the Norman expression for earl. So actually we have from that documentation that there were 3 earls in that invasion fleet. And that fits very well with the what we see in the tapestry. So it could be that using the shields is just a way of saying, well, these are the earls, and by the way, Harold was just an earl, not a king. If we look a little bit more on these, then we can actually see that there are some some of the Normans who produce more ships or provides more ships for the invasion than others, and that these are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 altogether. Actually, if we're looking at the tapestry, we'll see that there are 8 big ships. So probably the tapestry is very well aware of who is providing a lot of ships for this invasion fleet, and these ships are put into the tapestry so that they are being remembered. Because these ships, a number of ships that were put up for the invasion, was actually very important later when William was dividing England into fiefs that he was giving to his different counts and so on. So it looks very much like there's a good connection between what we see in the tapestry and what we see in the in this ship list. What we on one point, which is perhaps not so accurate in the tapestry, that is that when we are looking at where these noblemen from Normandy had their towns and lands, then a lot of them do actually have them inland. And I think that from the pattern that we can see with a lot of them coming from towns and so on, that the invasion fleet basically consisted of a lot of ships which were already there, which were being used for trade, used for fisheries, used for all kinds of purposes, and now they were just united once to be ships of that invasion fleet. And the ships which are being shown being built on the Bayeux Tapestry, that is probably just a very small share of what was actually in the invasion fleet. So probably if the Bayeux Tapestry had been an accurate source in terms of how the ships look, we should have seen a long array of very different vessels built for very different purposes being used for this invasion. But they all looked very light, I have to admit. So just to give some conclusions here at the end. Yes, in the Bayeux Tapestry, ships and seafaring are things that are used in order to demonstrate Harold's and William's qualities or lack of qualities as rulers. And the ideal ship, as depicted with William's own ship, which was, by the way, built for the invasion by his wife, that was a very long and slender warship. So that was typical warship of the archaeological record as well. And that tells us that the Viking way, in the sense that this way of building amphibious warships and using them as instruments to achieve power, was still in existence in Normandy in the late 11th century. But perhaps the comparison with the ship list shows us that it was perhaps more mentally present in the heads of the nobility and the kings, but that the urban power base, all those towns and harbors which were controlled by the nobility and which produced the ships for the invasion, many of the ships for the invasion fleet, that was already at that point very important. And indeed that became to be the future, because if we just move 100 years further ahead in time, the great warship is no longer that long ship of the Viking Age. It's actually the Hanseatic cog, which is a slow, high-sided ship which you can't row at all, but which is so high that it is very difficult to attack and therefore becomes an efficient warship. So in a certain sense, the biotapestry is talking about a specific history, but it's also giving us an insight into a mental history, a mental past, where the Viking longship was still an ideal. Thank you very much, and if you have questions, you're very welcome. If there are no questions, then I think that.
Why did you interested in this saga or song?
Well, the reason for being interested in the biotapestry is that it is one of the most used sources when discussing Viking ships and shipbuilding. A lot of people is pointing to it and saying that it shows this and that. And so my idea was simply to take a look at it and try to see what did it actually say. There's a lot of things that I haven't been telling you about here. For example, that proportions are completely hopeless in comparison to reality. In the tapestry, you can simply not make a realistic depiction of a ship in that medium because of the space that you have and the thickness of the thread and all that kind of things. And there are other observations. So I want to have a critical approach to that tapestry in order to try to take away some of the misunderstandings. But what I did today was just to take the positive results and take them out.
So this is the main source and the oldest source about ships.
Well, it's not the oldest, it's actually one of the youngest because it's 1070 or something like that. Archaeologically, we have warships and ships from, well, the 8th century, the 9th century, the 10th century, the 11th century. So there's a lot of archaeological material. But the thing is that the archaeological material is well, of course it's intentional, things have been made in an intentional manner, but we need to interpret that intention just on the basis of the ship itself. Here we have the ship put into a story, into a context. We know who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. We can start to make comparisons between how ships are being used to depict the one guy and the other guy.
Do you compare these designs with the Scandinavian depictions like Gotland picture stones of 8th century?
Mm-hmm. A lot of people have been doing that. These depictions actually have their patterns in Anglo-Saxon psalters from the 10th, 11th century, and not in Scandinavia. Basically, you can say that these are depicted in an Anglo-Saxon tradition. It looks like in practical aspects there was not a lot of difference between Norman shipbuilding and Scandinavian shipbuilding. We know that from the very few Norman ships that we have. But definitely in the way that you make pictures, there is a big difference between Scandinavia and Anglo-Saxon England and Normandy.
You said that there are differences in form between ships of William and his enemies, about Harald. But is there some difference in color that why you do the difference?
Yes.
Or you don't
I
analyze?
tried to look at colors and I just didn't find any pattern at all. So nothing that you could say which has the slightest hint of statistics in it. I think perhaps that it is a point here that Harold, the bad guy's shield is splashed. and that the Normans, they are all white. That's very easy. Well, it's a thought. Yeah?
Have you ever explored the question, have Vikings reached the American coast while they were traveling?
Well,
they traveled so far in there?
you know that they have, because of the settlement which was discovered on Newfoundland, Las Meadows, which is a 11th century Norse farm building, and there are both radiocarbon dates and a very few objects which shows that this is really from that date. So we know that, but also the literary sources are quite consistent that they did actually go to North America several times, and they produced names for different parts of it. And I think today the most usual way of thinking about that is that this was the most, that was timber source for the Greenland settlement. But that still lacks confirmation, because then we should really find North American timber on Greenland, and we haven't done that. But they were there.
Are there any other examples of tapestries like this? Because as I understood, it's quite complicated and it looks like some embroidery school, right?
Well, it is unique today. There are tapestries from many different periods in Northern Europe. We have fragments of a very famous one from the Usberg burial, 9th century. There are several others, but this is kind of unique in its technique. Actually, it's so unique that some of the techniques used here have just been found there. But it fits well in with that kind of tapestry work that we were producing in Anglo-Saxon England at that time in several respects. But there's nothing like this, nothing the extent of which is just comparable. Now I need to just take a brief look at the clock so that I'm not overrunning more than I have already done. I think that we should read Unser come up here. Thank you, everybody.
This is one of the very first towns in Scandinavia, together with the two towns in Denmark, Ribe and Hedeby, and in Sweden, Birka. So this is the very first urbanization in Scandinavia, and these are towns established at the very start of the Viking Age. And I will tell you about the results of a big excavation campaign between 1998 and 2003. And this is a personal story, because I was a student when this excavation started. So in 98 I was a master student, and I was able to later join the excavation, and it was my first job in archaeology, where I was responsible for all the objects from the excavations. So for you students, know this, at some point in your career, you just start onto something, and then it ends up being your academic career. So embrace that. This was an excavation that was part of the teaching department at our university. So we were a lot of students, and it was students from all over Scandinavia, and also some other countries like Finland and France. And this is still essential for my network. So I got my network as a student on these excavations. The excavations gave a large object material and a lot of structures. And we were a big team involved in publishing and researching on this material. So, very established professor and international team, and some of us that then became PhD students and did our first research based on this excavation. And this is the publications, and I will just let you know this link because this is an open access site for the University of Oslo. So we put out a lot of books and articles open access. I will just introduce this search Norwegian word that means search. So this is a way for you to find archaeology, literature, and history literature as well. During the excavation, we were also concerned about talking to the public, and especially to school children. So we invited a lot of school children to the excavation, and that inspired me to also write some books for children. It was written in Norwegian and then later translated to English. And if you ever get a chance to make a children's book, do it. It's the most fantastic and also the most challenging thing you can do when you really have to explain everything to a child. So when we started our excavations in '98, we had a lot of knowledge to build on. It had been an excavation in the settlement before, from the 50s and onwards, and it was a lot of graves that had been excavated at Karpan from 1867 onwards. One thing that's very important when you look at such a site today in Norway is that it has been a huge change of the landscape. This is what it looks today, but the shoreline changes has been rather huge. The shore was 3.5 meters higher, making much less strip of land available for the settlement area. And in the Viking Age, this settlement was totally surrounded by graves. So whenever you approach this town, when you sailed into the town, or if you walked into it, you would be met by the dead, not the living. It has some consequences that the shore level is so much lower today. The site is extremely dry. This is the area that we excavate. It's almost no wood preserved. What we see is this gray and brown differences in the color. But for those of you who are archaeologists in the room, you can probably even, it's not so good colors, but for a trained eye, you can read such a picture. Because what we have here is a house. It's a rectangular fireplace in the middle of the room. We see some wall benches on the side of the room. And this was very important for us when we found this house the first summer, because it solved the big question. Because until then, this was seen as a seasonal site with no housing. And here we had housing, and later on we discovered that these houses were used in the winter time as well. So this was a permanent settled site where people lived all year round. To really investigate these houses, a microscope was very essential. So we were looking at these layers through microscope, and that's where we really understood these houses. We could see how they had been cleaned, and that it was actually several houses on top of each other. And we even found a few houses that we were not able to see ourselves. but in the microscope they turn up. So if we put together all the information we got from the excavation, it's clearly that we have small townhouses. They are surrounded by ditches or fences, and one house on each of these plots, along the shore and with wells in the back and with the harbor area in the front. So when we add some imagination, this is how we think Kaupang looked like around 840. And putting together all the dating evidence, we see the activity starts very quickly around year 800. Then all this area is divided into plots. And 10 to 15 years later, it is houses built on these plots. And we also have one fortunate example of very few where, due to the water still coming in to a well, the wood is preserved. So we had a possibility for the dating of the wood. And that well has been constructed the summer of 808, so very early in this town's life. We even know the name of this town because it's a single written sources that mention this site. And this is a source called Ottars beretning. It's a travel account written down by the English king. And he reports on a man who has traveled along the Norwegian coast, and he passes this site called Kaupang in Skien. So this would be the name. And we can put it into a larger picture as well, using the place name evidence. So we have a name that tells about a people assembly, so a kind of a thing. We have this Skiringssal that we're going to later, the shiny hall, and we have the holy mountain and the holy lake. So we have a bigger picture that this little town belongs to. And if we widen the scope even more, we can see that this little town by the Oslo Fjord in Norway, it ties onto a very wide network. And this is the coins found at Kaupang. And as you see, it's the dirhams, it's the Arabic silver coins that dominates the picture, but also some West European coins. And if we add on other types of material, like the glass beads, we also see this picture of a very wide network and trading over large distances. But of course, this is objects that have been through many, many different hands and maybe different types of transactions before they reach Kaupang. If we look at objects that breaks easily, like pottery, it looks like the majority of the contacts go south-west towards the Frankish and Rhinish area, today's Netherlands and France. And we also see some Slavonic pottery, so we are in the Baltic area. And we also have the glass vessel, and that would also be the Frankish glass vessel. And when we see this together, the pottery and the glass, it is quite interesting. In Kaupang at that time, in Norway, pottery was not used. They stopped using pottery in the 6th century, and it was not used for many, many centuries ahead. But here we have pottery, but this is of course the goods that you bring in the wine in. So this is containers, but as you saw in the last picture, it's also some serving vessels. So actually you see a wine consumption. You see a continental wine consumption in a small town in Scandinavia. And if we look at the activities, we see that this is clearly different from the surrounding rural district. We see trade, buying and selling goods. And in Scandinavia, around 800, this is something completely new. Because it is gift giving that used to be the most important way of exchanging goods. And here you suddenly see that you can buy yourself something. And this is a weight economy where you weigh the silver. You notice that the coins, they are cut in quite small fragments. And we also see silver arm rings, parts of necklaces, and all kinds of silver objects being cut into tiny pieces. And so tiny pieces that it looks like you could buy something quite cheap, like a hen, or something like that, with this silver. And then we see a lot of craft activity waste. So it has been glass bead making, jewelry production, textile work, armor working, and probably also the crafts we don't see anymore because the leather is gone, the wood is gone, and so on. And the combs would also leave little traces behind in this very dry site. And this is a craft production that we see is particularly directed towards dress items. It's your clothes and it's your jewelry. So this is something that is produced for a lot of women. And I will even argue that I think a lot of women were involved in this production. So now I have arrived at the second part of my lecture, turning towards the urban Viking women at Kärrtorp. This is a picture from Charlotte Blindheim's excavation at Kärrtorp in 1955. She's excavating graves, and do some of you see? Can you see what kind of grave it is? It is boats. So this is a small boat here being excavated. The wood is gone, but you have the layers, and you can follow the layers to see the shape perfectly. Charlotte Blindheim's excavation was very important for women in Norwegian archaeology. She was a woman doing this excavation, and for her it was very essential to recruit a lot of women among her staff, because she had felt very alone. I can even add a note on that, where she was visited on this excavation by the professors, and they asked her, "Well, Mrs. Blindheim, are you doing an excavation, or is this a kindergarten?" So it was time, I think it was hard to female archaeologists. Moreover, her excavation, as I told you, gave a lot of burials. And these burials included a lot of female burials. And tools for textile production were found in many of these female burials. And if we then add the knowledge we have from the settlement area and all the textile tools being found there, and the knowledge from the graves, what we see is a production of textiles of many different types of qualities. Even the very topmost qualities. You see a very, like you see in all the Scandinavian Viking towns, you see a very distinct type of quality of the thread that they are producing. And in part, this production is clearly professional. And among the graves, the female graves, there are some quite richly equipped graves, and they contain a lot of textile tools. So my colleague Ingrid Øye, she argued that this is something that clearly suggests that on one side you see females who are producing textiles, but you probably also see women who are administrating this textile production that actually demands a lot of work from having the wool, processing it, and ending up with textiles that could be sold away in this context. And probably you see here some females that build quite huge fortunes, that get wealthy from this activity. Combining this evidence from the graves, where this textile equipment primarily belonged to female graves, and also looking at contemporary written sources from continental Europe, where it's also females who produce the textile. She finds it likely that quite many of the inhabitants of Kaupang were involved in its textile production, and then at very many different stages, from the ones doing the hard work to the ones earning a lot from this. And actually from some of the recent investigations of the skeletons in Birka, you can actually see that it is some women that are clearly dying from a lot of lung diseases, suggesting that they've been a lot indoors in this smoky environment that these houses were. We also have a large material from the production of metal jewelry. And it's likely that this is partly directed to the urban population. There are some objects in this assembly that we do not find in the graves in the surrounding districts, but it's also clearly directed towards the rural population, people in the houses, the farmers in the surrounding districts. And it's a huge differences in quality. We have, you see at the top, the high quality gold and silver objects. You have the more ordinary brass brooches, like the oval brooches. And then you have, at your topmost end there, some lead jewelry, some quite cheap jewelry. We must assume it was a cheap metal. It's found in huge amount in the waste material. And this is not the typical Scandinavian type. Rather, this is a type that Egon Warmers, the professor who has interpreted this, says this is jewelry without any ethnic or regional association. You find them all over Northern Europe and in the Baltic. And it's been quite usual to say that people involved in metalwork are men. But if we turn to this jewelry production, when it comes to ironwork, it is several indications that it is men. But for the jewelry production, we don't have the same evidence, because tools from this production are very seldom found in Scandinavian graves. So actually it's quite like we really don't know. And looking at this material from Kaupang, there are actually some tools, especially these crucibles, that they are made by using a very tiny finger. It could be a child, it could be a woman, but it's certainly not a man. So I would say opposite of Johan Kalmer. We know for sure that textile work was done by women, but we don't know for sure who did the metalwork when it comes to fine metals. And the same is the case with the making of glass beads, where we have few possibilities to dictate. Among the jewelry we found at Kärban, there are some they are tiny pieces of jewelry. And this is a material that will be used by a Frankish or Frisian person. And they are found scattered around in the area where people lived. And again, Egon Warmers, who know this material very well from further south in Europe, he says that this is an indication of Frisian and Frankish people walking in the streets of Kärban. And it's male jewelry and female jewelry. So we have a combination of Frisian men and women walking in Kärban. And I should also mention that some of the Slavonic pottery, as I said, they are not using pottery in this part of Scandinavia and Norway, but they are used for cooking locally, and they are even repaired. Could we even see some Slavonic people in this town? We don't. We have. I mentioned the female burials, and in some cases we have the preserved skeleton. As you see, the preservation conditions for the skeletons are not the best. So when we talk about female silhouettes, it's often based on the female dress items. And as you probably know, it was some interesting evidence coming up last year from Birka, the Swedish Viking town, where one of the most famous warrior graves that we've always said was a man proved to be a woman. So we should now be very careful about gendering only when we have the objects. And this is not only about the male graves, but I think we should have this question when it comes to the female graves as well. But for the time being, we have, this is the evidence we have to work with. This is one example I will present to you of two women buried at Kärban. I don't think you see it so well, but it is boat grave. And in each end of this boat, it is a woman. And in between them, it's a man, and a horse, and a dog. So this is really a social burial, so to say. And I think that these two women, they illustrate that urban women of the 9th century, they could have very different life stories. We could never get the complete life story, but if we look at these two women, we have one with the one to the right. She is buried next to a man, and they are, in many ways, an equal standing couple. They are equally well equipped. She has a silver arm ring, a silver finger ring, other gilded brooches, textile tool. He has a full set of weapons. So they mirror each other. But in the other end, along here, you have a woman who is also buried with some nice jewelry, but also with some very strange object. She has a bronze bowl, it's imported, and it has a runic inscription. And she has a dog that is killed and chopped into pieces. And then she also has a staff, and for some this is indication of this being a volva, or a ritual specialist. But anyway, it's quite clearly that in one way you have two females that are portrayed quite differently. So I think we have two strong women, economically and socially, but with quite different roles. Looking at the graves in general at Kärban, we have all these cemeteries, and these cemeteries, they have quite different burial customs. Somewhere it's grave mounds, other places it's flat graves, it's inhumations, and cremations. But if you look at female and male graves, they are very equally in all respects. They are mixed on all these cemeteries. They are equally rich or not so rich, depending on the grave. And if you look at where they are situated in the landscape, it's also very much the same. So, as my colleague Marianne Moen concluded, it's quite clear that they belong to the same social structure and also ideological structure and power structure. And then we have this shields hall that I mentioned, the shiny hall. Due to a chance, when we were walking over this slightly small hill, having a lunch, we discovered Viking Age Hall. So this is a hall building. It's on a built-up plateau. So this is something that we know is elite indication. You have this in Sweden as well. This might be the shiny hall that the Kaupang area is called after. And in very much of the literature about Kaupang, this has been mentioned as the chieftain's hall. But I don't think this is the chieftain's hall. I think this is the ruler's hall. And I even think it could be in plural. Because I think that in the Viking Age we have very strong indication for a man and a woman ruling together and filling each other's role. And I would mention one specific thing about this that brings it to the female's sphere. Because this hall building is actually built on the top on a female, all the female burial. And I don't think that it is a coincidence that it is in the middle part of this building. Someone has actually constructed this hall on the top of the grave of their foremother, or at least someone they wanted to be their foremother. And then I should also mention that it is a very mighty and powerful woman or two, quite nearby to Kaupang. A little further north, you have the Oseberg burial, and as you see from the dating, these are people that lived in Kaupang's friends. And it's also a clear link to Kaupang. Unfortunately, as I said, we don't have the woodworking at Kaupang. So whether all these beautiful carved wood objects were made there or not, we don't know. But decorative metal nails is clearly something that is done at Kaupang. So this is someone who had a strong opinion on Kaupang, I'm quite sure. And I was quite intrigued by Jan Bill telling us that the ship shows the quality of the ruler. So here's another ruler showing the quality of her. But going into the details about Oseberg, that is for another time, that's another story, and I hope to come back someday to tell that story. So thank you very much. I think there's room for a few questions, if someone has a question.
How much graves of women with weapons, like shoot maidens in Kaupang?
Women graves with weapons?
Yeah.
None. So it's one grave with an axe, but that is the axe type. But you know, the problem at Kaupang is the skeletons. Few of the graves have a skeleton. So the way of saying this is a male grave or this is a female grave is the object. And if our assumption there is wrong, then we have an interesting problem. I just wanted to mention this burial in Sweden because it's so interesting that the grave where the skeleton is very well preserved and people had assumed, because of skeleton, that it was a man, but ADN proved that DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Do you know the average age of male in this settlement? You found the average age?
Average age?
Yeah.
Approximately. It's quite likely that the average age of the people who grow up is quite low. It's like most of them are in the 30s and 20s.
І останнє питання.
Is there some historical castles in Norway, like in Denmark and Scotland? No.
Not that we have found. But it's quite likely that this Kjærvang area is in some part of the Oslofjord is part of Denmark, or at least part of the Danish kings.
Дякуємо. Дякуємо.
One more question.
Останнє.
Are there some evidences of Scandinavian women taking part in conquests or that warrior crusades equally as Viking men did, or as it's depicted in modern day films and so on? Is that true or fact or else?
It's not. It's debated. People are discussing it, but the evidence is a few indication of females in these English campsites, and then it's a written source, and there are probably some better experts on this than me. It is a Byzantium source that is telling about a fight against someone who's probably Scandinavian Vikings. And when they count the bodies afterwards, they to their surprise discover women among the dead bodies.
Thank you very much.
So,
Дякуємо. І на завершення. Так. На завершення ще поринемо в світ дуже прекрасного, тобто ще в нашу музичну лірику.
Були люди невірні, вони в Бога не вірили, а вірили у смачище, оте люте є зміїще. А вірили у смачище, оте люте є зміїще. Дали цмоку шею в року, щонеділі по людині, прийшла черга аж до царя, хоч сам ступай, хоч дощ давай. Стали вигри вигравати, стали панну наряджати, та й вивели кінець мора, моли панно щиро Бога. Та й вивели кінець мора, моли панно щиро Бога. Вона тоді сильно злякла, пред Господом крижем клякла, аж тут летить сам смачище, оте люте є зміїще. Аж тут летить сам смачище, оте люте є зміїще. Що із рота огонь паше, що із очі іскри скачуть, де не взявся святий Юрій, на білій коні з коп'єю в руці. Дарив цмока серед ока, забив цмока на віка, чого хочеш, святий Юрій, чи ти хочеш срібла, злата? Ти хочеш срібла, злата, А чи хочеш розписання по всім світі розсилання, щоб читали і писали, Георгія святкували, читали і писали, Георгія святкували. Я не хочу срібла злата, тільки хочу розписання, по всім світі розсилання, щоб читали і писали, Георгія святкували, читали і писали, Георгія святкували.
На завершення, що є там. Таке, щоб, може, разом ми заспівали з вами всі. Хто знає, хто вміє, хто не вміє. Ніч яка місячна. Буде пісня, всі знають? Буде пісня.
Яка місячна, зоряна, ясная, видно, хоч голки збирай. Прийди, коханая, працею зморена, хоч на хвилиночку грай. Прийди, коханая, працею зморена, хоч на хвилиночку грай. Ти не лякайся, що змерзнеш лебеденько, тепло ні вітру, ні хмар. Я приверну тебе до свого серденька, а воно палке, як жар. Я приверну тебе до свого серденька, а воно палке, як жар. Ти не лякайся, що ніженькі босії мочиш холодну росу. Я ж тебе вірная, аж до хатиноньки сам на руках однесу. Ти не лякайся, що зможуть підслухати тиху розмову твою. Сплять вороги твої, змучені працею, ані шелесне в гаю. Сплять вороги твої, змучені працею, ані шелесне в гаю. І разом. Ніч, яка місячна, зоряна, ясная, видно, хоч голки збирай. Прийди, коханая, працею зморена, хоч на хвилиночку грай. Прийди, коханая, працею зморена, хоч на хвилиночку грай.